Chapter 7. They say once is an accident, twice is a coincidence, and three times is a pattern. Thomas had lost count of how many times he'd been thrown from one extreme to the other. But the latest episode, that mad, destructive mania, triggered by a poorly chosen antidepressant, and the bitter realization that followed about bipolar disorder, had finally convinced him. These weren't just mood swings. This was his cross to bear, his lifelong diagnosis. And the higher the ascent, the more devastating the fall. This time, the flight was beyond measure. He soared to the heights of grandiosity, challenged the entire world and its lies, and destroyed everything around him with the energy of a berserker. And when that artificially fueled energy ran out, he plummeted. He fell lower than ever before. If the previous depression had felt like a vicious swamp of apathy, this one was the Mariana Trench, the absolute bottom. It wasn't just a lack of mood or energy, it was a complete disintegration of his personality. His brain, which so recently had been working at supersonic speeds, generating brilliant ideas and multitasking, chatting, watching the news, and listening to music simultaneously, had now simply shut down. It was drained beyond measure, burned out entirely. His concentration was utterly absent. He couldn't read books. The letters blurred, the meaning slipped away, and he would forget the beginning of a sentence before reaching its end. He couldn't watch movies or TV shows. The plot vanished within minutes, and the images failed to stick in his mind. For hours he might sit, staring blankly into space, thinking of nothing, because there was simply nothing left to think with. His memory had turned into a sieve. He forgot even the most basic things. He forgot to lock the front door, to turn off the gas, to remember the names of people he had just been talking to. He might go to the store to buy bread and come back empty-handed because he had forgotten why he went. Calculating change, planning a simple route, this had all become impossible tasks. His cognitive functions were shattered. Physically, he was in shambles as well. Constant, leaden fatigue weighed him down. He slept 14 to 16 hours, but woke up even more exhausted. His movements had become slow, his speech quiet and monotonous, with long pauses. Sometimes it took tremendous effort just to lift a hand or move his feet. He hardly ever left the apartment his parents lived in, where he had been forced to move back after losing his job and being unable to afford rent anymore. He lay on the couch in his old room, turned toward the wall, and time had stopped for him. He felt neither hunger, nor thirst, nor pain. Only an endless, gnawing void inside and an overwhelming sense of guilt and shame for what he had done during his mania. Memories of his crusade against Sly, the scandal at work, his mother's tears, and the severed connections with friends burned him from the inside. But he had no strength for repentance or attempts to make amends. There was only the desire to disappear, to dissolve, to cease to exist. But somewhere deep in the darkness, a tiny, barely noticeable spark flickered. A memory, or rather, a belief rooted in early experience, and the words of that first doctor, though they were flawed in their essence. In 6 months, things might get easier. 6 months. That timeline became a sort of anchor for him, a mantra. He just had to make it 6 months. Endure. Wait it out. Perhaps it was false hope, self-deception, but it kept him from plunging completely into the abyss. And he went to the doctor again, or rather, his parents almost forcibly took him to another psychiatrist, finding a specialist who, according to reviews, had experience working specifically with bipolar disorder. This visit was different from the first. Armed with his bitter self-awareness and memories of his recent mania, Thomas was able to share more. He spoke not only about his current depression, but also about his previous highs, about euphoria, boundless energy, insomnia, grandiose plans, aggression, and how the antidepressant had turned him into a monster. He used words like mania and depression, spoke about cycles. The new doctor listened very attentively, asking many questions about his past, his family history, and the nature of these highs and lows. And finally, the correct diagnosis was given: bipolar affective disorder. Not just depression, but a pendulum, a swing, a disorder requiring a completely different approach to treatment. The prescribed medications were different this time. The antidepressant was kept at a minimal dose under strict supervision. The core of the therapy consisted of mood stabilizers, medication designed to prevent the pendulum from swinging, to smooth out the peaks and lows. A neuroleptic was also added to alleviate remaining anxiety or psychotic symptoms. The doctor didn't promise miracles. The doctor honestly explained that finding the right therapy would be a long process, requiring regular tests, dose adjustments, and patience with possible side effects. He also emphasized that the primary goal wasn't complete recovery, and this is currently unattainable for bipolar disorder, but rather achieving stable remission, one that would last as long as possible and offer the best quality of life. Thus began Thomas's long journey back home, to himself. Thomas dutifully took the prescribed medications. At first, he didn't feel any noticeable improvements apart from some side effects: drowsiness, mild nausea, and a dulling of emotions. That magical pill capable of instantly bringing him back to life simply didn't exist. He stayed home for almost 6 months. The idea of looking for a job or attending interviews wasn't even on the table. He simply wasn't able to. All his strength went into just getting through each day, taking his medications, forcing himself to eat, and making himself shower. His social isolation reached its peak. He'd never been the life of the party, but after everything he'd been through, he withdrew completely into his shell. He grew even more distant from the few acquaintances and lost friends who might still have remembered him. He didn't congratulate anyone on New Year's or birthdays. If any of his old acquaintances happened to reach him by phone and ask how he was doing, he would reply briefly, "I'm okay, managing." He shared nothing about himself. And what could he say? "Hi, I'm currently being treated for manic depressive psychosis, recently got fired, and nearly destroyed my parents' lives." Admitting to his illness felt equivalent to admitting he was crazy, abnormal. The shame and fear of being rejected were too overwhelming. He preferred silence, building a wall to shield himself from the outside world. His parents supported him as best they could. They fed him, paid for his medication, and tried not to pry into his soul, though their worry and confusion were obvious. Their quiet presence provided both support and an unspoken reproach, a constant reminder of his inadequacy. But gradually, very slowly, millimeter by millimeter, his condition began to stabilize. The medication was working. First, the deepest despair began to lift. Then, it became slightly easier to concentrate. He managed to finish reading a newspaper article and eventually a chapter in a book. His memory started to return. He stopped forgetting basic things. His sleep improved. His appetite returned. It wasn't an overnight return to normalcy. It was more like climbing out of a deep, dark shaft to the surface. Slow, heavy, with frequent stops, but still a movement upward, toward the light. When he felt he had enough strength for at least minimal physical activity, he decided to try to find some kind of job. Something simple that didn't require mental strain or communication. He saw an advertisement. They were hiring people to put up flyers in apartment buildings. And so he went. The job was elementary, but it gave him exactly what he needed. A reason to leave the house, to move, to complete a straightforward, understandable task. For hours, he walked through different neighborhoods in the city, methodically visiting building after building, putting up flyers. The fresh air, physical activity, and the sense of completing a task had an unexpectedly therapeutic effect on him. He began to feel a little better, a little more alive. After that, he took on a courier job again. It was a type of work he was familiar with. It didn't require any special skills, kept him on his feet and moving, but also minimized interactions with people. He delivered documents, packages, and sometimes pizza. The pay was small, but it was his own money. It gave him a sense of at least some independence, restoring a bit of the self-esteem that had been crushed by illness and failures. It seemed like life was slowly beginning to improve. His condition stabilized. He regularly took his medication and stayed under his doctor's care. He had a job, although a modest one. He lived quietly, inconspicuously, trying not to draw attention to himself, afraid of disturbing the fragile remission he had achieved. But, as we know, people always crave more. Having grown accustomed to stability, Thomas began to feel a sense of dissatisfaction. The courier job was reliable but lacked prospects and paid poorly. He wanted something more normal, more aligned with his education, hard-earned as it was, and with the ambitions that were beginning to timidly awaken along with his improving condition. He wanted to prove to himself and to others that he could live a full life despite his diagnosis. And then he started thinking about the bank again. The thought scared him. The banking industry was tied to his darkest memories, the deep depression and the destructive mania. Returning to that world seemed like madness, playing with fire. But there was another side to this. It was in the bank that he had once tasted success, when he had acquired valuable skills in communication and sales. Perhaps he needed to go back there to close a gestalt, to prove to himself that he could handle the job now that his condition was under control, to once again feel like a competent professional, not just a flyer poster or a pizza delivery man. The desire for a normal life, a stable job, a decent salary,